Well, good evening. Great to see everybody here tonight. Tonight we're going to sing a familiar tune, but perhaps unfamiliar lyrics. We're all familiar with the doxology, praise God from whom all blessings flow, but did you know there's a lot more verses to that tune? And it's the title of this hymn is All People That on Earth Do Dwell. It's actually in our hymnal. It's at number 5 in there if you want to look that up. But our brothers and sisters across the pond sing this a lot more often than we do. It obviously is the tune of the old 100th, what we call the doxology. But there are 5 verses tonight, so we're going to sing All People That on Earth Do Dwell. So let's stand and let's sing this great hymn together.
All right, we are in Genesis chapter 25 tonight, and I do want to thank the church before we get started, just in regards to letting Hillary and I have some time off over this last week. It's greatly appreciated, had a good time. I'm grateful as well, both for Peyton and Blake. There's never been a time in my ministry to where I really have had other pastors here at the church to count on when I'm gone, and both before I came back and as soon as I came back, hearing reports just of how faithful and good of a job Peyton did at Janelle's funeral, and then Blake preaching Sunday morning. And so I'm forever grateful for that. Just don't tell Blake this, but I'm not going to let him be able to preach again because he used my microphone, and apparently he's got some funny shaped ears. And I've been working on getting this microphone back on my head for about 15 minutes now. So if I'm messing with it, it's because of Blake's ears. Lisa's not, and she agreed. So that's right. And so it's definitely his ears, not mine, that are misshapen. So Genesis 25, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 18. You can follow along as I read. It says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer la Haroi. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdiel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Nephish, Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. Moses tells us that Abraham lived to be 175 years old. That's really old. Not quite as old as before the flood, but still, that's pretty old, 175 years. In fact, it was 100 years after coming to Canaan, the land that God had promised him, living as a sojourner there in that strange country, awaiting God's promises to be fulfilled. 100 years. You know, growing old is not always easy. My grandfather, he died in 2013 at 90 years old. And he used to tell me all the time, he'd say, James, growing old isn't for sissies. I'm just 37, but I realize I'm realizing that more and more all the time. It's not always easy. Growing old is difficult from time to time. Your body begins to break down. You can't do the things that you used to do. As you grow older, you begin to witness the deaths of so many loved ones. I think about my grandmother. She died just a few years after my grandfather, but she had 4 siblings. There were 5 of them total. She was the last of that group, and all of them, they lived in Dadeville. Really, it was on the outskirts of Dadeville, which if you're on the outskirts of Dadeville, you're in the middle of nowhere, right? So that they lived in the community of Mount Carmel, and all of them lived together. I mean, sister next to her, brother across the road, they were all there. They had cousins. She was the last of her siblings. She was the last of all of her cousins. Even in her entire graduating class in high school, she was the last of all of them. Even the little church she went to, Mount Carmel Baptist Church, it's still going, but the ones that she was close to, that she had that close family relationship, she was the last one of them. I mean, she lived long enough to see everybody who she was close to, I mean, outside of her children and grandchildren, die. And that was hard for her in her last years, especially after my grandfather died and she had taken care of him. There really wasn't much for her to live for anymore. And very quickly, her health plummeted right after that. As you grow older, you begin to lose your independence. and you have to begin to depend on people more and more and more. You're more susceptible to sickness and disease. Solitude and loneliness can oftentimes become prevalent. I've seen regularly as well that there's a sense of uselessness as these things begin to happen. But while all of this might be a reality of old age, while all of this might be true, it doesn't mean that we cannot continue to remain faithful to the Lord and serve the Lord. And we find an example of this here with Abraham here in chapter 25. In particular, verse 8. Verse 8 says that Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. It says here, good old age. It describes these years. And again, this last 35, 40 years, we don't hear anything about Abraham. This is all we know about it, is that he died of a good old age, meaning that this last season of his life was one characterized by happiness and satisfaction and blessings, even in this last season of life. And now this is clearly wrapping up the story of Abraham, especially considering the story that comes right after this is the birth of Esau and Jacob, which actually happened 15 years prior to Abraham's death. So Moses isn't writing this chronologically. What he's doing, he's ending the story of Abraham so that next week he can begin the story of Esau and Jacob and dealing with Isaac as a father and the two sons and moving on with the story. He's wrapping up one to move on. And so we're finding here the end of the story of Abraham. We're seeing the old age, how Abraham finished his life in this last season. And so what we're looking at tonight is remaining faithful through every season of life. In particular, we're going to be looking at this last season, but these principles apply to every season. Whether that's the season of being a child or a teenager, whether that's the season of being single, whether that's a newlywed, whether that's new parents, whether that's empty nesters, whatever that season looks like that you're in, these are principles that can be applied through all of these. And so as we look at this, remaining faithful through every season, what can we learn from Abraham? First is that he remained faithful to the Lord. He remained faithful to the Lord. The latter years of Abraham's life after Sarah died apparently slid on silently. I mean, we've learned so much about Abraham throughout all the years, and then he knocks out pretty much 4 decades with one verse. He breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. That describes the last 4 decades. There are no more remarkable war victories or visits from angels, no more upheavals and changes in life. There was just life. Yet it appears that it was life that was lived faithfully. It says that Abraham again died in a good old age, full of years, gathered to his people. I think that we see here is not just saying that Abraham was old, but that even in that season that he is still being spoken very highly of, that he was highly regarded even in his older age. And here's the thing that we take from this, is that Abraham remained faithful even when the miracles stopped. Abraham remained faithful even when the miracles stopped. He remained faithful when his life went from being characterized as radical to just merely ordinary. You know, it's very easy to be on fire for the Lord, man, when you're prospering. When all of these things are happening and you can look and you see, man, the only way that this is happening in my life is because of the Lord. He is the only way that the only explanation to this. We get excited. But then when there's nothing special, when there's nothing miraculous going on, when it's just life, when it's 4 kids who won't shut up and stop talking, so that you can watch an Auburn basketball game in peace. You know, and when they're complaining about the food again and again and again, when you're waking up and you're going to work, just like you've done every day for the last 20 years, to the same job for the last 20 years, doing the same thing for the last 20 years, a job that you haven't even liked for the last 20 years, that you've been every day doing it. He remained faithful in that. There's something to be said about that he loved the Lord and trusted the Lord in that season as much as he did in the miraculous, radical seasons. Too often in life, we think we have to be living the so-called radical life when sometimes God just wants us to live in the ordinary. You know, general faithfulness is often a great testimony to the Lord. Faithfulness, consistency, even humility, a willingness to stay faithful even when going unnoticed. A willingness to stay faithful even when going unnoticed. You know, we all love the great testimonies. The person who spent 30 years on drugs, woke up every morning in a ditch, and the Lord radically, miraculously saves him, and now he's a preacher, and 1,000 people are getting saved every time that he preaches. Like, we all love those stories. But what about the man who got saved when he was a boy at age 7? And stayed faithful in children's ministry, and stayed faithful in youth ministry, and sought to please the Lord by obeying his parents, and continued to follow the teachings of his parents, and continued to follow the Lord in college, and then married a faithful Christian woman, and they had children, and he never taught a Sunday school class. He maybe vacuumed the floors. He trimmed the hedges outside. He did things around the church that nobody noticed, but every day he woke up reading his Bible, loving his family, serving his family, serving his church. He's there week in, week out with his family. He's there day in and day out. Nobody's writing a book about that. If they did, nobody would buy it because it'd be pretty boring. But for that man to remain faithful in that season is just as remarkable as the person who remains faithful when God is moving mountains, so to speak. When the movies are being made and the books are being written. Being faithful in the ordinary is just as important as being faithful in the radical. And for many, I think the senior adult years can be hard because faithfulness looks so different in that season. Gone are the days of keeping nursery. Gone are the days of chaperoning youth trips. Some of you can't wait to get to that point. Gone are the days of Sunday school teaching. Gone are the days of physical labor in the church. Gone are the days of singing in the choir because you don't have the same voice that you used to. Gone are even the days of being able to make it to church every Sunday morning because your body doesn't always work every Sunday morning. You don't know how you're going to feel. You don't know if you're going to have the strength. And so you just have to tell the pastor, I hope to be there Sunday, but we'll see. Gone are the days of being able to give large amounts of money to the church. And now that you're a widow and you're on Social Security and you barely have enough to pay rent and bills, you're just giving $10 a month. And you feel as though you aren't as faithful because you used to be the one who not only was giving your tithe, but you were funding youth and children to go to youth and children's camp, but now you're only giving $10 because that's all that you have. And it's a struggle because it doesn't seem like you're being as faithful in light of the fact that you are doing less than you have ever done before in your life. Again, even in this life, we read missionary biographies. We hear these amazing testimonies, and we begin to wonder, is my life as important as theirs? We look at our lives, and we stay at home with our children every day. We take care of our aging parents. We go to work. We help with our grandkids. We volunteer at the hospital, some other civic service. And it seems like our life is not as worthwhile But God works in the ordinary as well as he does in the radical. And I believe that Abraham here sets that example. Gone were the days of miracles. Gone were the days of the radical, amazing works in his life. And in were the ordinary days. I read an article once from Desiring God that asked and then answered the question, can I still sing Amazing Grace even if I was saved at a young age? Can I still sing Amazing Grace even if I was saved at a young age? You know, it is an act of grace in someone's life that all that they have is an ordinary testimony. You know, one of my prayers regularly for the children of our church, not just my own children, but the children of this church, is that the children of this church would have boring testimonies. I don't want the children who grew up in this church to have radical testimonies, because that means they spent a season in wayward sin. I don't want that. I want a church full of boring people. I mean, that's good, right? And so regularly, I have different things that I pray for the church each day. Thursdays is the day that I pray for the children in the life of our church. That's one of my main prayers. God, give them boring testimonies. Because let them grow up trusting their parents and loving their parents and obeying their parents. Let them grow up trusting and learning from their grandparents and from their Sunday school teachers and from me and the other pastors. And let them cling to it and believe it at a young age and grow up following it. That's what we want. That's what we desire. And that is just as much of a work of grace in their life as someone who has gone through a time of sin and waywardness. And regardless of what season we're in, sometimes we are in those seasons to where, man, we have the time and the physical ability to just serve and do everything we want in the life of the church. And other times, for whatever reason, we don't. But regardless of what season we're in, the call is to remain faithful in the ordinary as well as the radical. Abraham did that. Number two, as we look at Abraham, is that Abraham continued to serve the Lord. Okay? He continued to serve the Lord. Which part of being faithful is serving the Lord. And in particular, as we look in chapter 25, we see Abraham taking care of his family, setting his household in order. We'll speak more to that in point 3. But the point that I want to make here is one thing I've often told the senior adults in the churches that I've served is they've struggled with this new season, is that faithfulness looks different in every season. God's call for us is not necessarily for us to be nursery workers. God's call isn't necessarily for us to be Sunday school teachers or to be whatever. God's call is for us to be faithful. And that looks different in every season. There were 2 ladies at my church in Kentucky. One, I've mentioned her before, Miss Anna Etta Brown. She's the one, the Bible Before Breakfast lady that I've mentioned that had such an impact on my life. One of the most godly and biblically knowledgeable lay people that I've ever met. When I first got to Clay, her husband, Malcolm, had just begun the stages of dementia. And Annetta, she told me several times that she had pretty much done everything in the church other than preach. She'd even been the secretary. She had a time there. She had done everything. And again, just one of the most beloved people. I mean, everybody looked up to her. She was always serving, always doing. And as soon as her husband got sick, there wasn't any of it because he needed her attention essentially 24 hours a day. She'd bring him to church and would have to leave. One of the greeters would then get him and walk him to his Sunday school class because he'd get lost without him. One time I was filling in, substituting for the Sunday school class of those probably in the 45 to 55 age range. Mr. Malcolm's like 92. And he comes walking into our Sunday school class. We all know what's going on, but we just greet him and say, come on, Mr. Malcolm, come sit down and join us. He'd gotten lost somehow. I don't know what happened, but he'd gotten lost. And so we called him on in there. But her life was consumed in taking care of him. She didn't have time for the church. And it killed her because that was everything that she had known. She felt like she wasn't doing anything. And so I had to remind her all the time, Miss Annetta, look, God has called you to be faithful. And faithfulness in this season of life looks drastically different than any season of life prior to this. Your obligation right now is Malcolm. We'll take care of things at the church, is Malcolm. And if there's other ways you can figure it out, which she did. She prayed more than anybody that I know. She would send cards and letters. So she found ways to still serve. But then after Malcolm died, her health immediately plummeted, and so she wasn't physically able. She eventually had to go into a nursing home. She was one of the ones that it killed her. It ate her up, that she did not have the money to give. And then the apartment she was in, one time they bumped up her rent, and she called and she said, I've only been given like $10 a month. Now I've got to pay $50 extra. I don't even know how I'm going to do that. I'm like, Miss Annetta, it's okay. Like look, God calls you to be faithful. Whatever, if it's 2 pennies, then give 2 pennies. I'm not expecting hundreds of dollars from you. Just be faithful. Miss Norma Harris, the same way, as her health plummeted, it bothered her. She would call me almost weekly, and whenever she missed church, she'd always call and apologize. I'm like, Miss Norma, I know that you want to be here. And if you could be here, you would. You don't have to apologize. I know it. I'm fine. I understand. And for us to just be able to get this mindset that whatever season of life we're in, faithfulness is going to look different in that season. For a mother who has 4 children under the age of 6 at home, to be honest, faithfulness in that season of life is going to look very different than newlyweds with no children. It's going to look very different than empty nesters who have no children at home. Before grandchildren come around, then you have to start babysitting them. There's, and even in that empty nest season, a lot of times you're done taking care of children and now you got to take care of parents. Like there's, you never know what you're going to have. Every season can look drastically different for everybody else. And us understanding that faithfulness looks different in every season, and God's call is whatever season I am to figure out how to be faithful and how to serve. And in our senior adult years, in the older years, we've got to understand that old age is a blessing for the righteous, not a curse. Old age is a blessing for the righteous, not a curse. Yes, you may not be able to do as many things as you used to be able to do. Another guy at Clay, Dion Parker, he taught Sunday school for decades and he had to stop. And he said, Brother James, I love teaching. I want to, but he was in his 80s. But he said, I study my lesson on Fridays and Saturdays and I get to church Sunday morning and I can't remember what I studied. That happens, and so it's life changes and it hurt him. It bothered him. But old age, even then, you may not be able to do what you used to do. It's not a curse. It's a blessing. In fact, Proverbs 16:31 says, gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. Psalm chapter 92, one of my favorite passages about the senior adult years. Being a senior adult in that season of life doesn't mean that you are now useless to the church, to your family, to other people. Psalm 92, verses 12 through 15, with verse 14 being the emphasis. But it says, the righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. Listen to verse 14. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green. to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Service in that season may be different, but it doesn't mean that you can't be faithful, you can't be green, you can't be full of sap, you can't continue to be growing. It's just different. Point number 3 is that Abraham left a heritage. In his senior adult years, in that last season, he made sure to leave a heritage, in particular with his family. Now, dealing with Keturah, it says that he had another wife, Keturah. 1 Chronicles 1:32 tells us that Keturah was actually a concubine, not technically a wife. Now, with a concubine, there was a commitment with a concubine. She wasn't just a mistress, but at the same time, she wasn't a full wife either. A concubine in that time period was viewed kind of as a secondary wife. And honestly, as we look at this, it's impossible to know whether Abraham married Keturah before or after Sarah's death. The Hebrew there is very difficult. Some translations say that Abraham had taken another wife, which could imply he had married her before, while others, like the ESV, say that he took another wife, which the fact that this was written after Sarah's death could have meant he married her after Sarah died. We don't know. We do know he had another concubine, Hagar, and I understand life was different then. I don't fully get how so many men who were important to the faith had so many concubines. I don't understand the culture and the reasoning and everything there. Clearly, God doesn't want us having wives and secondary wives, or tertiary wives, like we just have a wife. Like we know that, we understand it. So there's a lot that I may not understand about the culture and the reasoning behind that, but it doesn't change what happened. Keturah was not technically a wife. She was a concubine. Don't know if it was before Sarah's death or after, but regardless, he had Keturah and he had children through Keturah. But as we look at this, Abraham was faithful with his family, with those children that he had, with both Hagar, Sarah, and Keturah. And we see that before Abraham died, he set his house in order. He made sure that his son Isaac had a wife. We talked about this last week. He made sure that Isaac had a wife so that Isaac could have an heir. And he made sure that the wife was not a foreigner, but was rather somebody who would be faithful to the Lord. And a big thing in regards to the family that we don't need to miss, it's easy to miss, is that though Keturah was a concubine, verse 6 tells us that he still provided for all of his children that he had with Keturah. Now, again, concubines were second-level wives. They were wives that were obtained without having to pay a bride price like you would a wife. And the children that you had with the concubine did not receive an inheritance from the father, nor did they expect an inheritance. They knew that they were like halfway between legitimate and illegitimate. The father took care of them, but they received no inheritance. Nevertheless, Moses made sure to tell us that Abraham still took care of them. Tradition did not demand that he leave anything except to the children of Sarah, which was only Isaac. But since Abraham was a man of God, he provided for all of his children. And not only that, he made sure that they had a place to live while continuing to make sure that Isaac was the son of promise. Also, Ishmael re-enters the story. The last thing we heard about Ishmael, he and Hagar were sent away, and then in the very next chapter, in chapter 22, it referred to Isaac as Abraham's only son. And so in these last years, we don't know the story, but apparently Abraham reconciled with Ishmael and apparently reconciled Isaac and Ishmael enough for them to get along to bury and to honor their father. And so in these last years, Abraham wasn't sitting around doing anything. He was leaving that heritage for his family, setting his house in order. And that was important to do so for the promise being fulfilled in Isaac's life. It was important for Abraham to show faithfulness to his sons. You know, it is hard to pass down a faith when you are living unfaithfully. It is hard to teach your children and grandchildren to follow Jesus when you are not following Jesus. You can say all you want, do as I say, not as I do, but they will do as you do, without the Lord being gracious and graciously saving them from that. But for the most part, they do what you do. And Abraham was faithful to them, even though culture did not demand him to be faithful. He was, anyways, to pass down that heritage. Now, that doesn't mean that all of his sons followed that heritage. In fact, as we're looking at the Keturah's children, then Ishmael's children of Keturah's, Midian was the most significant of these children, at least that we learn of. It appears that the Midianites kind of meshed with the Ishmaelites, who were not people of God. And so the Midianites eventually kind of were absorbed into them. We find the Midianites again in the story of Jacob and Esau and with Moses. Esau actually married two of Ishmael's daughters. Nebaioth is the firstborn son of Ishmael, and Mahalalel and Basemath, who were Esau's wives, were both said to be Nebaioth's sisters. And they both caused problems within the family because neither one of them were faithful to the Lord. And they pulled Esau away, and they brought great pain to Isaac and Rebekah because he married women that they shouldn't. And lo and behold, you marry somebody you shouldn't, and they cause problems not only for you, but extended family as a whole. And then with Moses married a Midianite woman as well. In Exodus chapter 2 and in chapter 18, we find this in chapter 2. Moses sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite, most likely to kill him. Moses protected the Israelite by striking the Egyptian dead. Once Moses realizes others knew about this, he flees to the land of Midian. There he meets the 7 daughters of the priest and helps water the flock of the sheep. He builds a relationship with the priest and ends up marrying one of the daughters, Zipporah. And so Midian shows back up. The Midianites show back up. So Abraham, left a heritage. His son Isaac followed that heritage. We don't know about the other ones. We know many of them didn't. But Isaac did, and he was the son of promise. And eventually he laid that heritage. Isaac followed. Jacob followed. Eventually the Messiah follows as well, which leads us to point 4, is that God keeps his promises through all seasons. God keeps his promises through all seasons. Remember, God had promised when Ishmael was first sent away, God had promised Abraham that he would make Ishmael a father of many nations, just like Isaac. And we learn here in verses 12 through 18 that Ishmael, in fact, had 12 sons whose families became distinct tribes. Their tribes are believed to have populated a large portion of ancient Arabia, though not all of it. The number and strength of this family were the fruit of that promise from the Lord made to Hagar and to Abraham concerning Ishmael. And so even in this story of Abraham's death and the story of the last season of Abraham's life, these genealogies, which we so often skip over because they're boring and we can't pronounce any of the names, we find truth there. This is Moses letting us know, before I end the story of Abraham, you remember that promise that God made to him. God fulfilled it. God was faithful. God kept his promise. Whatever season of life we're in, the day of prosperity, the day of adversity, the season of prosperity, the season of adversity. Solomon tells us in the day of prosperity, be joyful. Rejoice, be happy. But in the day of adversity, consider that God has made the one as well as the other. God is in the season of hardship as much as he is in the season of joy, in the season of happiness, in the season of ease. And for us, whatever season we're in, we can be that strong cedar. We can be green. We can be full of sap. We can continue to produce. It may look different. We may not be able to do the things that we used to do. We may function differently. Life may be harder, but we can still serve. We can be faithful in a new way. So we're going to head now into our time of prayer. If you have been joining us at home, we appreciate your time with us. So for those of you who are here, we can take out our prayer